Hello, New York Giants fans, and welcome to the Valentine's Views podcast here on the Big Blue View YouTube channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. The New York Giants were on the first edition of Hard Knocks off season on Tuesday night, and it was an interesting edition where we learned a lot about the Giants. We heard some discussion of some of the really interesting off season decisions that they made. And here to help me break that all down, discuss what we learned, what we think about what we saw, is Big Blue Views Tony Del Genio, who is sitting outside on his porch today, enjoying the beautiful weather. How you doing, Tony?
I'm doing fine, Ed. Yeah, I'd like the Giants roster. There's a little bit of construction going on in my house, so I figured I'd take it outside and get away from the noise on a beautiful
Oh,
summer.
I hear you. I hear you. There's when you own a home, there's always something going on,
Yep.
I think anyone who owns a home is familiar with that. And shoot, when you're doing stuff from home, you always put up with a little bit of banging, with some dogs barking, with whatever. So it is what it is, folks, and hopefully you guys enjoy what we have to say here, despite any banging or interruptions or whatever. So Tony, let's get into it. um we knew that the Giants had some editorial control over the product, over what's going to be shown on Hard Knocks. So we may not have seen everything, but we did see enough last night to learn some things. And it'll probably lead into talking about Saquon Barkley, and it'll lead into talking about Daniel Jones and Brian Burns and the rest of that. But my biggest takeaway last night was this, folks. You can put away this idea that John Mara is telling Joe Schoen what to do. It's very, very clear that that the construction of the Giants roster is Joe Schoen's show. The Daniel Jones decision was Joe Schoen's. What happened with Saquon Barkley, it was very clear, despite John Mara's sort of wistfulness and some pushback from some of his front office members, it was very clear that this was Joe Schoen's vision and this is what he was going to do. Also, the Burns trade, but for me, my biggest takeaway, as I said, very, very crystal clear that this is Joe Schoen's show, and that the way the Giants are structured now is moving toward Joe Schoen's vision of how he wants to structure this team, how he wants to spend his money, and all of that.
Yeah, I agree completely. John Mara, unlike some owners in the NFL, this is his business, and so you have to expect that he's going to be emotionally invested in it. He's not just looking at the bottom line. He cares about the team. He cares about the players, and I think that became clear in the one conversation they showed between the two of them, that he's got a soft spot in his heart for Saquon Barkley, and he said in an ideal world, we'd manage to keep him. But I think it's also pretty clear that he's not in there trying to dictate to Joe Schoen.
Mm-hmm.
He's letting Joe do what Joe thinks he needs to do. And so, yeah, all of these kind of conspiracy theories out there about Mara being the strings pulling the Shane puppet. There's just no evidence that that's really true.
No, it's not. And I think, I've said it before, but for Giants ownership, for John Mara, for Steve Tisch to be fair to Joe Schoen and Brian Dable, who came in from outside, who came in from the Bills organization, you have to judge them on their own merits. You have to let them sink or swim with their own decisions. And if they sink and they'll be gone. And if they swim, then the Giants will be in a better place than they've been, for a long time. So I think I think it's a good thing, whether you agree with all of his decisions or not. I think it's a good thing that we see that pretty clear evidence that John Mara might not agree. He might not want to go that way. Even last night with the Barkley decision, he kind of said, well, if you're going to do that, then we have to draft a running back high, which Shane pushed back on and didn't do.
Mhm.
So I I think it's a good thing that Mara and the Giants are letting Joe Shane and Brian Daboll do this their way.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Yeah, you mentioned the idea of drafting a running back high, and what that kind of feeds into is Joe Shane's overall philosophy of how to build and structure an NFL team. And of course, the prevailing wisdom these days is you don't do it around a running back. And so, therefore, using high draft resources on running backs the way Dave Gettleman did with Barkley in 2018, that's not something that you're ever going to expect Joe Shane to do.
Joe was very, very clear in what we saw, on Tuesday night. He was very, very clear that he wanted nothing to do, not with Saquon Barkley per se, but he wanted nothing to do with committing $12 million of his salary cap an individual running back. Particularly, as he said, Tony, I just want to mention this. He brought up the analytics about 27-year-old running backs. He brought up the analytics about carries, including the more than 700 touches between rushes and receptions that Barkley had at Penn State. Barkley's injury history. You know, he threw out, I think I don't remember if it was talking to Mara or someone else in the front office. He threw out the number, maybe if it's 7 million, we'll talk about it with Saquon, but it was very, very clear that he wasn't spending that kind of money on a running back, and using that data, I thought, to back up his point, I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and I at the risk of reading something into the things he said at various points during the show, I think he's very conscious. I mean, he did say this at one point of not, insulting Barkley with like a $7 million offer and things like that. But and he pointed out several times they can tag him for $12 million and so on and so forth. I I think that well, it's not clear to me whether if it came down to that and Barkley did not get any offers from other teams, whether he would have in the end signed him for $12 million, even though as you say, and I agree with, that is not something he really wanted to do. But I think he perhaps, and again, I'm reading something into this that might not actually be there, but I think he recognized and felt something about how important Barkley has been to the Giants and how he deserves to be treated with some respect. And so I could have imagined a scenario in which he wound up actually giving Barkley the $12 million against his own best intuition about what he should do, just because there was an issue there about let's say, what Barkley has meant to this team over the last few years. And so in the end, I and again, I'm just guessing. I wonder if he was even a little bit relieved, and I guess we'll find out more about this as the series goes on, and we see about his reactions when he finds out that Barkley is just going to Philadelphia, and maybe he didn't get a chance to make a counteroffer. But I wonder whether deep down inside he actually is a little bit relieved that happened, and it maybe kind of got him off the hook for making a decision to commit a lot of dollars that maybe he didn't really want to commit, and it allows him to proceed with his vision of how a modern NFL team should be structured in a salary sense.
Yeah, I think we wrote about this at Big Blue View after Barkley signed with the Eagles, and after the Giants signed John Runyon and Jermaine Illuminor, offensive linemen. This, to me, is in line with the way Joe wants to build a football team. Joe referenced during the show how emotional the negotiations were with Barkley a year ago, how much that was draining and how much it took out of him and how much he didn't want to go through that again. And and I, a little bit differently than you, Tony. I think that if Barkley had come back to the Giants and said, the best offer I've got is 7 or 8 million, that Joe might have gone there. But and I don't know, what wasn't clear was, did Saquon come back to the Giants when he had the offer from the Eagles and give the Giants a chance to match? But what's clear to me is, at that number, the Giants weren't going to match. I don't think they thought odds were that Barkley wouldn't get that kind of an offer. Although Joe Schoen did say, there might be, there might be one team out there that's willing to go and do something like that, and it turned out that there was.
Mhm.
But I think they thought there was a possibility that he wouldn't find the money that he wanted, and he'd wind up coming back to them, and maybe they could get him for a year or 2 years at 7 or 8 million. And I think they would have been happy with that. But I know Barkley wouldn't have been happy with that. I found it interesting. I used to say about Dave Gettleman, everybody disagreed with a lot of the decisions that Gettleman made, and whether I disagreed or agreed with them really was never the point. One of the things that I said about Gettleman was kind of what we're talking about with John Mara being as hands off as he is with Joe Schoen. Um, you have to, when you're in that position, you want to sink or swim with the courage of your own convictions. And it was obvious. Joe was talking to his staff about replacing Barkley 3 or 4 days after the season ended, and it was obvious toward free agency that he was getting some pushback from his staff about Barkley. He was getting pushback from, I think it's director of pro scouting Chris Rossetti.
Mhm.
He was getting some pushback from director of player personnel Tim McDonald. And you could tell from the looks on their faces and from what they were saying that a lot of these guys weren't thrilled about the idea of moving on from Saquon Barkley. And Joe just said, this is what we're going to do. We're not paying a $40 million quarterback to hand the ball to a $12 million running back. We're going to go support this guy by getting some offensive line and getting some other weapons and do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of that is them kind of maybe disagreeing with that approach, and how much of it is just the normal in meetings like the one that we saw. The whole idea is to bat the idea around and get all points of view, all perspectives on it. Um, I thought what Chris Rossetti, I thought what both of them said actually were very relevant points to make. Chris Rossetti said that it's just all you need is one team that has a lot of money to spend.
Mhm.
And I mean, somebody threw out $20 million. I don't know whether it was him or somebody else or whatever, but he said all it takes is one team with a lot of money to spend. And of course, naturally, watching this with hindsight, we know that, and somebody even mentioned the Eagles and the Lions, right? I
I
don't know
thought
whether it
that was Rossetti,
was Rossetti,
by
right? Yeah.
who by the way was extremely impressive.
Oh, I think everyone agrees with that. That I said, wow, this guy. I mean, he seemed right on just about everything that he said. Not that you can really score things that way, but I think that you have to. The one thing that you have to remember, and I don't know if this applies to the Lions so much, but it certainly applies to the Eagles, and that is how much money you have to spend in today's NFL is a very fungible thing. It's not just the salary cap anymore because of the introduction of the idea of having void years in a contract. So, how did Howie Roseman manage to sign Saquon Barkley to that 3-year, $37 million whatever contract? Well, 19 million out of that $37 million is in a 2027 void year. And Howie Roseman throws void years out there like it's nothing at all. He's got $400 million total in void year costs, and that's just his philosophy, his way of doing business. So with the Eagles, they don't have to worry how much under the cap they are. If they see a player they like, they think they're in their Super Bowl window, which I certainly agree with, and they say, look, this guy's going to help us get over the top. Let's go for him. Whatever we have to pay him to get him here, we'll do it, and then we'll just shift the money into the future and worry about that in a few years when the salary cap's higher. So I think you have to take that into account whenever you're in, let's say, in a I don't want to say a bidding war, but a competition with other teams for the services of a player, that other teams may be willing to go places that you're not willing to go, because the Giants so far have not shown much of an interest in accumulating tremendous void year costs. So they're right. It just takes one team, and that one team can be doing it for a good reason or because their general manager is wacky. But it's only going to be that one. And there are wacky general managers out there. We know that.
Yes. Yes. There's a quote unquote retired one living in Cape Cod these days.
Did you say hello while you were there?
No, he and I did not cross paths. Folks who don't know, I was in Cape Cod last week, home of former Giants GM Dave Gettleman, and no, we did not cross paths. I'm not sure Dave would have wanted to talk to me anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing I wanted to say, that you brought up the Eagles, and obviously that's where Saquon went, and we've talked about this before, I think, but what people have to understand is, as you said, the Eagles are in their Super Bowl window right now, where they're competing for that, and they walk away disappointed every single year at this point if they don't hoist that Lombardi trophy. And you make moves like Saquon Barkley, which is a short-term 1 or 2 year move. I mean, I don't think it would shock anybody if Saquon Barkley has a big 2024 season. On the flip side of that, even if he has a big 2024 season, it wouldn't shock me if he falls off a cliff in 2025 in terms of performance. So when you're the Giants, when you look at those analytics, you're not in your Super Bowl window. You're in your, we're trying to build a team that becomes consistently relevant window. And you can't make those 1 year decisions, those 2 year decisions, because you can't throw 19 or 20 million dollars of void money out there, because then you're not going to have that money to spend when maybe you are hopefully in that window where you think you can make a run. So you can't make that kind of decision right now. And the analytics that Joe Schoen mentioned absolutely backed up what he did.
Yeah, I think that you saw throughout this first episode that his vision of how a roster should be structured is slowly coming into focus. And of course, again, we have the benefit of hindsight. And so, it's one thing, somebody, as somebody, whether it was, I guess it was Tim McDonald, who asked during that same meeting, okay, you don't have Saquon, and like, okay, who replaces that? What's the Giants offense now, right? And of course, in hindsight, we know that the answer to that is Malik Neighbors, right? But at that time, it's fair to raise that question. You get rid of what was clearly your best offensive weapon for the last few years. Now you're left with Daniel Jones, and yes, maybe a better offensive line, but who's he going to throw the ball to? And so they wound up answering that question in the way that I think Joe Schoen wanted it answered.
Right. He was very clear that he thought there would be a weapon available at 6. So,
And I love the
Go ahead.
little teaser we had at the very beginning of the show, which I hopefully we'll get more about later on. At the very beginning, when they're just showing like little bits of clips here and there, there's one point where he's sitting there basically saying, come on, neighbors, be there. And it's at some point during the draft when the Giants aren't ready to pick yet. And I'm interested to see exactly at what point in the draft he's making that comment And
Mm-hmm.
how high was Neighbors actually really on his list? Was this after they tried to trade up for
Mm-hmm.
Drake May and couldn't? Was it before Marvin Harrison Jr. was picked by Arizona? Was it after that, and while he was waiting for the Chargers to see if they would take a wide receiver? I'm very curious as to just how high on their board Neighbors was, because it was obvious even from that one little snippet that they were really high on Neighbors.
Absolutely. Tony, at this point, I think that we have to talk about quarterback. We have to talk about Daniel Jones because obviously I've said this ever since the the 2023 decision where the Giants paid Daniel Jones first and ended up tagging, Saquon. Quarterback is more important than running back. Joe made it clear from the beginning of that negotiation that quarterback was first, and and whatever happened after that happened after that. Um, whether the Giants end up being right or wrong about Daniel Jones, the philosophy I think is correct. And you know, what I said was they don't want to be running back centric. I said this, more than a year ago. They want to be quarterback centric. And he basically made that clear with his we don't pay a guy $40 million to hand the ball to a guy that makes $12 million, comment.
Mm-hmm.
They want Daniel Jones. They want their quarterback to be able to win them games. Now, some people would look at what Joe said about Jones last night as Joe, quote unquote, doubling down on Jones. I don't look at it that way. Joe said this is the year for Daniel. And what he's saying to me isn't I'm doubling down and I'm banging the table because this is my guy. What he's saying is we're paying him this amount of money, and this is the ultimate year where he needs to show us, whether or not we can go forward with him or not. They've put in their minds, they've done as much as they can to put around him what he needs to be more than a facilitator, to be more than than a 15 touchdown a year guy.
Mm-hmm.
And if he can't do that, it's crystal clear. He's not the quarterback next year. To
Mm-hmm.
me, that's not doubling down. That's saying, we've got this guy, we're paying this guy, we're going to support this guy the way that we think is best. And if he can't do it, then we do something else a year from now.
I agree with every word of what you said, and I saw a lot of the reaction on Twitter or X last night after this was over, and I thought so many people were misinterpreting Shane's remarks. The things that were clear to me about what Shane said are that, as you say, first of all, he recognizes that Jones had no chance to succeed last year because of that offensive line, and as he said, and I'll edit this for propriety, but blankety blank Mahomes couldn't win behind that blankety blank line last
Basically,
year.
is what he said. Yep.
We had
Basically,
we
that's
had
what he
we had
said.
three we had three practice squad guys out there for the Miami game. He said, and so on, and that's true. And actually, just interesting little side point. If you actually look at Patrick Mahomes's performance under pressure, well, it's better than Jones's has been, but not all that much.
Why did
Patrick,
why did why did the Chiefs lose the Super Bowl a couple of years ago?
that's
They
right.
lost the
To
Super
Bay,
Bowl
right?
because Mahomes was running for his life
That's right.
and and ultimately didn't play all that well.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
and he still made a couple of ridiculous throws in that game the way only Mahomes can, and so nobody's saying that Daniel Jones is even in the same ballpark as Mahomes is, but I should say even Mahomes is really affected by pressure. Last year, I just looked it up. He had like about a 49% completion percentage on throws in which he was pressured. He had 5 TDs, but 8 interceptions when he was pressured. So even Mahomes becomes an ordinary quarterback when he gets pressure. Any quarterback will, and so Shane
And
recognized that Jones had zero chance with what that offensive line was doing the first few games of the season. But as you say, that's not the same as doubling down on him. He even said we have to find out, is he our guy for the next 10 years or do we move on? I think that's close
mhm,
to I think what he actually said.
right,
And so that's telling me that once the season is over, the decision is made. He either re-ups to pay him year 3, or some way or the other he's finding a replacement for him by 2025, and it all depends on whether what he sees from him this year is enough to convince him that it's worth paying that third year. And it includes, by the way, not just the performance factor, but the injury factor, because he specifically mentioned three injuries in 2 years. We can't. The best
right,
predictor of the future is the past, he said.
right. If he can't stay on the field, then he can't be the quarterback in
Yeah,
2025.
yeah.
Um, y- I think I like I said, and you and I have both said it's not Joe saying he's our guy and this and whatever, but they're paying him. They've got to find out, and we'll see. So it's I don't. What I'm not sure of is what the bar is for Jones. I think with the weapons that they've got, I mean, I think that if you're the Giants, you want at least 2022 Daniel Jones, if not better than 2022 Daniel Jones, because when the Giants gave Jones that 4-year, $160 million contract, what I said was they didn't pay him to be 2022 Daniel Jones. They paid him to be more than that because they thought as he grew with Dayball and Kafka in the offense, they thought he could be more than that. And if he can't be, then if the best they think he's ever going to be is 2022 Daniel Jones, then maybe they do move on. But I think that's the bar. I think he has to at least reach that level. I don't know what you think the bar is, Tony.
And so I'm almost in the same place you are. I think I'd go a little further and say he has to exceed that level by some clear amount. Again, he doesn't have to turn into Mahomes. Nobody's going to do that. But you know, and you always have to ask, what are the extenuating circumstances? So let's just lay out kind of the ideal scenario for Jones, that he stays healthy. Malik Neighbors turns out to be the real deal and looks like somebody who could remind Giants fans of OBJ, early OBJ. Okay, let's imagine that Runyon and Illuminor do a good job, and JMS improves in his second year, and even Evan Neal improves enough in his third year, so that they have a functioning offensive line. Doesn't have to be one of the best, but a functioning offensive line where he's not running for his life on every snap, and that all these people stay healthy so that he has kind of the full range of weapons and enough protection for a quarterback to be expected to get the job done. Then I think you've got to ask, if you can only give us 15 touchdown passes with all of those things in place, then that's probably not enough. It would be enough to keep you at a salary of 25 million or something like that, but it's not enough to keep you at the what by year 3 will be the $37.5 million average annual salary over 3 years that he will have gotten. And so, yeah, something beyond 2022, I think it will be necessary if all those other things fall into place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's a good point. I said it, at least 2022 probably better because as that's they didn't pay him to be 2022 Jones. They
Yeah.
paid him to win. They're paying him to to win games for them. And if he can't, then they move on. I just wanted to ask you, did you have any thoughts on what we saw in terms of how the Brian Burns thing developed?
So I think one of the things that's fascinating to me about this, and I think so much of this I mean, the Saquon story is certainly, intriguing in its own right to see what's going on in the discussions that are taking place. But I think one of the most fascinating things about this first episode, and that I assume we're going to see through the other episodes, is just getting a peek into how things actually happen in the NFL. And so I just found it utterly fascinating that he's standing on the sideline, and Brandon Beane's there, and the Canales, who I
Dan,
guess is the no
and Dan Morgan, the GM for Carolina.
Morgan,
Yeah.
the GM of Carolina, and they're just standing there chatting, and Morgan just kind of like suddenly drops this bomb. Would you be interested in two firsts for Brian Burns?
You know,
He
what
wasn't, he wasn't even looking at him.
what fascinated me about that, Tony, is if you go back and look at it, Brandon Bean, Buffalo GM, was standing off to the side, and Dan Morgan just sort of, Morgan and Joe Schoen. Joe talked about this. They've been friends. They've worked together. They've been friends since about 2001, since when Morgan was a rookie in Carolina, and Shane was just beginning his scouting career, and their families are close and all that. And I'm going to guess that Morgan thought Shane was a guy he could work with to move Burns off the roster. And he just sort of quietly and casually dropped that. And Brandon Bean turned around. He like snapped around with his arms folded, just staring at Morgan like you just offered Brian Burns to the Giants. He's just staring at him like, I can't believe you just did that while we're standing here on the sideline in Mobile, Alabama.
I know. I thought that was the single best moment of the entire hour or whatever, 40 minutes.
No, I'm gonna disagree with you on best moment. Best moment of the night was Joe Shane's grandma. The best moment of the night was Joe Shane's grandma.
I take it back. Jeez, Grandma.
Joe Shane's grandma.
I'm 93
begging for Sam Hartman. I'm 93 years old, but I'm not blind.
That was great. That was truly
yes.
Great.
That's the best moment of the night. Shane's like, geez, Grandma.
But in terms of just how the process works, I guess I have this naive point of view that GM just get on the phone with each other and ask about things, but this is just like dropped casually in conversation, and I say, wow, it's like that's actually how business winds up getting done in the NFL. And the other thing about that, right, as you pointed out, is that Morgan goes way back with Shane. And so if you have a GM who's kind of well connected with other people in the league, as he seems to be for a guy who's relatively young, then that's an advantage, right? And of course Shane has, I think, a very easygoing personality, and so he's probably someone that I'm guessing people might be pretty comfortable talking with and just bantering with, and so on and so forth, and so there's that whole aspect of being a GM that I think a lot of us, certainly I, probably don't appreciate enough, about how these personal relationships happen and how that leads to business getting done.
Well, it's interesting because as you were talking about that, I thought about a year ago, and I thought about the Giants moving up in the draft for Jalen Hyatt. What did Joe Schoen do in moving up for Hyatt? He turned to Brian Daboll and he said, you're pretty tight with Sean McVay. Why don't you call him up? We'll even give you the message that you to deliver. You call him up and see if he'll do it. See if he'll play ball with us. They used Daboll's relationship with McVay to get that deal done. And Joe's talked about this in the past. When you're talking about moving around the draft board, when you're talking about making these kinds of deals, there's a trust factor. If you're gonna move down or whatever, if you have to trust that the guy's not going to double cross you. that he's not going to, take your offer and go shop it elsewhere, or, that he's not going to take the player that you want,
Yeah,
and you have to have those relationships. And I think it's like anything else. In a lot of ways, everything is a relationship business.
that's right. That's right. And in the end, he winds up getting Burns, of course, for a second and a fifth.
When
So,
when they when they thought it was going to take at least a one plus more. So
mhm,
they have to be thrilled at the price they paid, because they kept their number one and they added Malik Neighbors with that number one.
mhm,
So
mhm.
I don't think the Burns deal ever gets done if they have to give up a first round pick.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
But
I agree with that. I think, I mean, they knew that they had to go offense one way or the other in round one, because not that the defense doesn't have its problems. The defense, really did not perform very well last year. But I think at least the Giants have some pieces on defense now. And yes, there are holes they need to fill, but they've got some real pieces on defense even before the Burns trade. Whereas on offense, you have to say, well, how many pieces do we actually have? Especially if we're anticipating losing Barkley, how many pieces do we actually have on offense at the skill positions? So
mhm.
you knew
Yeah,
there was offense, I think, first base.
it's so interesting, Tony, because you did a piece a few weeks ago about the roster rankings, and how everybody thinks all these ratings or rankings put the Giants at the bottom of the list in terms of 2024 roster. And I know that you pointed out some analytics that disagree, and I'm actually working on something that's a little bit more anecdotal, but I also disagree, but with the caveat that there's a lot of possibilities with this roster that haven't been seen yet. And I think there's a list of things that I think have a possibility of happening, have a better than even, or I would say have a realistic possibility of happening that could change that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see what happens with the roster, but I'm just not one of those people who looks at the Giants and says that's the 31st, that's the second worst roster in the NFL or the worst roster in the league. I don't think that's the case. It's not a championship roster, but it's not a horrendous one either, because there's a lot you can point to. There's a lot of good pieces that you can point to. Anyway, last thing for me quickly is just to ask you if there were any other takeaways from the show last night that you wanted to mention before we call it a day?
The only other one, since we spent the entire time talking about offense, just say something about the defense other than Burns, is I thought it was interesting watching Dable talk to Shane about why he wanted to offer the defensive coordinator job to Shane Bowen, and what he seemed really impressed with was Shane Bowen's team's run defense, and especially run defense in the red zone, where they were like a top 10 team in the NFL, and he seemed to really, really like that. And number one, I thought that's unusual in today's NFL, where you're so worried about the passing game of other teams. But it also then reminded me of a couple of things from the past, and so there was this one, I think. Might have been a Monday night football game. It was either Monday night or Sunday night, but I think it was maybe Monday night football game back in 2021, Shane Bowen's first year, when Buffalo was at Tennessee, and they were down by 3 in the closing seconds of the game, and they were down at the Tennessee 2-yard line on 4th down, and they had the choice of kicking the field goal. Or 4-yard line or something like that. And they had the choice of kicking the field goal to tie the game and send it into overtime, or to go for the win right then and there. And Dable decided to go for the win, and he gave the ball to Josh Allen on a quarterback sneak. And the Tennessee defensive line stuffed Josh Allen for no gain, and Tennessee won the game. And so that was Dable directly going up against Bowen on that play. And the other play I remember was the Giants, the first game of the Dable era, when the Giants went for 2 against Tennessee at the end of the game, when they could have tied it by just kicking the extra point. And of course, in that case, Barkley scored the 2-point conversion. But if you actually watch the play, Bowen had the right defense called. He had a linebacker right there who had Barkley dead to rights, and Barkley just gave that linebacker
Right.
a move
Right.
and eluded him so that he was able to get into the end zone. And so you wonder, how much little incidents like that kind of stick in the mind of someone like Dable. He's saying to himself, "Yeah, this guy screwed me a couple of times down near the goal line." And I
Mhm.
like that defense, and maybe I want him doing that for us instead of somebody else. But I was just interested in general in his reason based on run defense rather than pass defense.
That's a good point, Tony. And I think I've said this before about Shane Bowen, but we know that Bowen's going to be a four-man rush guy, whenever he can be. Um, Going to be a guy that plays, I guess the right word is more traditionally on defense. He wants the old NASCAR package kind of that Steve Spagnuolo had put together. He wants to be able to trust four guys to go win. And Spags would always blitz when he had to. He would be creative. He would do things. He's still that way in Kansas City. Um, for me, that just reminds me more of the traditional Giants defenses,
Mm-hmm.
the defenses that were dominated by their front fours or front sevens. And I think that's what I think Shane Bowen is hoping to build. And I find that I just find that it's like a comfortable old shoe, because that just fits what your vision of the Giants is if you've followed them for a long time.
Yeah, and they're three-quarters of the way there with Thibodeau, Burns, and Dexter Lawrence. And the question is, who's that fourth guy? And we
Mhm.
see a little bit of a snippet showing Bowen's first kind of presentation about his defense to the team, which had been circulating all week, so it wasn't new.
Mhm.
But he's basically speculating, who can that other kind of quote unquote penetrator be? And he said,
Yeah.
can it be Basham? Can it be Ryder Anderson, or whoever?
Memo,
But
memo, memo to Shane Bowen. It's not either one of those guys.
yeah,
All right.
probably
It's
not either
it's
one of
not.
yeah, yeah. So the question is, who is that going to be then? And it may be that guy is just not on the roster this year, and uh, well, and they'll just have to live with having three of those four instead of four.
Mhm. Yeah, and hope that they can get something out of Azeez Ojulari in some
Right,
fashion.
right. Which, and again, one of the things that we have to remember, I think, going into this season, because Ojulari has been a disappointment to the last couple of years after kind of an exciting rookie year, and Thibodeau hasn't been quite what people wanted him to. But the thing we always have to keep in our back pocket is that this year Andre Patterson's going to get to work with the edge guys for the first time, and so you look at what he did with Dexter Lawrence and turned a very good player into the best or second best, let's say, interior defensive lineman
Mhm.
in the NFL. I did love the part where who was it? Rossetti was kind of drooling over the possibility of having Dexter Lawrence and Chris Jones in there on the same line.
Yeah, that was interesting. He's like, we probably can't make that happen, but that sure would be nice. But yeah, nice try, Chris.
Yeah,
Maybe when you get to be a GM somewhere, you can put 85% of your salary cap into two defensive linemen. You
right.
go you go right ahead and see how that works. See how many points you score. But yeah, um you can't have everything in one off season. You add as many pieces as you can. And Tony, it's amazingly 3 weeks to training camp, amazingly enough.
Yeah, the time flies, and this is going to make the time go faster. So I have to.
Absolutely.
One nice thing about the Giants being on this is that you do get something interesting every. You're guaranteed of one interesting thing every week.
Absolutely. And four more episodes of Hard Knocks, and we'll continue to break those down each and every Tuesday night and Wednesday morning. Give you guys the best insight, the best impressions that we can, both on the website and here on YouTube. So please look for that in both places. And everybody have a happy and safe 4th of July. Please be careful out there with your fireworks. So with that, thank you as always for listening. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.